Welcome back to the deep dive. Ready to dive into ionotropic glutamate receptors.
I know, I am.
We're going to break down these receptors, get to know their subtypes. AMPA, NMDA, kainate, see what ions flow through them, and explore how they work in synapses, why NMDA needs a helping hand, and how these receptors shape the way we learn and remember. To help us navigate all this, we have our expert here.
I'm excited to be here. It's going to be an interesting one.
So let's just jump right in.
Yeah.
What exactly are these ionotropic glutamate receptors, and why are they so important?
Well, you can think of ionotropic glutamate receptors as doorways on brain cells. They're usually closed, but they swing open when this key, a neurotransmitter called glutamate, arrives. And when they open, they let charged particles called ions to flow into the neuron, changing its electrical charge. And that change can trigger a signal that travels to other neurons, allowing communication throughout the brain.
Okay, so glutamate is the key.
Uh-huh.
And this process is basically how brain cells talk to each other. I'm curious, though, you mentioned ions flowing through. What kind of ions are we talking about? And what's the significance of their movement?
So the main ions involved are sodium and calcium. You can think of sodium as the workhorse. Its influx through these doorways creates a quick electrical change called an excitatory postsynaptic potential, or EPSP. It's kind of like a spark that can ignite communication between neurons.
So sodium is like the quick messenger relaying information rapidly. What about calcium? What role does it play in this cellular conversation?
Calcium is more like a VIP guest. When it flows in, it doesn't just trigger a quick spark. It initiates a cascade of events that can lead to long-term changes in the connections between neurons at the synapse. This ability of synapses to change is what we call synaptic plasticity, and it's the foundation of learning and memory.
Wow, so calcium's the key to making memories stick. That's amazing. Now, you mentioned that there are different subtypes of these receptors, AMPA, NMDA, and kainate. Can you unpack those for us a bit?
Absolutely. Just like there are different types of doors, these subtypes have unique features and functions. Let's start with AMPA receptors. They're the most abundant, and they're responsible for that fast workhorse sodium influx we talked about. Think of them as simple swinging doors. Glutamate binds, the door opens, sodium rushes in, and a signal is generated quickly.
So AMPA receptors are like the express lane of neural communication.
Got it.
Yeah.
Now, what about those NMDA receptors? I know they're involved in learning and memory, but they also seem a bit more complex.
You're right. NMDA receptors are fascinating. Imagine them as a door with a special lock. Unlike AMPA receptors, NMDA receptors need more than just glutamate to open. They require a combination of glutamate binding and a change in the neuron's electrical charge, a process called depolarization.
Yeah.
It's like needing both a key and a password to unlock the door.
That's interesting. Why do NMDA receptors have this extra layer of security? It seems like it would slow things down. It does, but for a good reason. You see, this coincidence detection feature of NMDA receptors makes them really well suited to strengthen connections between neurons that are firing together. When two neurons fire simultaneously, the electrical change from one neuron can help remove that lock on the NMDA receptor of the other neuron, allowing it to open and let calcium in.
Ah, so it's like a synchronicity check.
Yeah.
NMDA receptors are activated only when both neurons are active at the same time, strengthening the connection between them. That's really clever. So we have the speedy AMPA receptors and the more selective NMDA receptors. What about those kainate receptors? What's their story?
Kainate receptors are the less understood members of the family, kind of like that distant cousin you rarely see. They are similar to AMPA receptors in that they primarily allow sodium to flow, but they're involved in specific neural circuits, and their full range of functions is still being explored. They're definitely a hot topic in neuroscience research right now.
It sounds like there's still so much to discover about these receptors.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into the weeds, can we step back and visualize where all of these receptors are located within a neuron? We keep talking of these doors and locks, but where are they physically situated?
Excellent question. To picture that, we need to zoom into the synapse, the tiny gap between two neurons. Imagine it as a bustling communication hub where neurons exchange information. These receptors, our metaphorical doorways, are strategically located on the receiving end of the synapse on the postsynaptic membrane.
So they're perfectly positioned to receive those glutamate keys and open up to allow ions to flow. That makes sense. Now, you mentioned that NMDA receptors need this coagonist, this depolarization, to become fully active. Why is that? What makes them so special that they need this extra step?
It's a brilliant design, really. This requirement for both glutamate binding and depolarization gives NMDA receptors a unique ability. They can detect coincident activity between neurons. They only spring into action when there's simultaneous activity from both the sending and receiving neurons.
So they're not just responding to any signal. They're specifically attuned to signals that arrive at the same time.
I'm starting to see why they're so crucial for learning and memory.
Exactly. When we learn something new, our brains need to strengthen connections between neurons that are firing together at the same time. Those coincident firing patterns are like a neural code for important information, and NMDA receptors are perfectly equipped to detect and reinforce that code.
That's fascinating. So NMDA receptors act as gatekeepers, ensuring that only meaningful connections are strengthened.
Precisely. And it's not just about strengthening connections. Either NMDA receptors also play a role in weakening connections that are no longer relevant, a process called long-term depression or LTD. This constant fine-tuning of synaptic strength is what allows our brains to adapt and learn throughout our lives.
This is truly mind-blowing. It's amazing how these tiny receptors can have such a profound impact on our ability to learn, remember, and adapt. It is remarkable, and what's even more fascinating is that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to discover about these intricate receptors and their role in shaping who we are.
Well, I definitely feel like I've already learned a lot. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's pause here and let all of this incredible information sink in. We'll be right back after a quick. Okay, so before we paused, you were saying there is still a lot more to learn about ionotropic glutamate receptors.
Oh, yeah. We've talked about these receptors as doorways for ions, but that's not the whole story. It's really just the beginning.
I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Well, when those NMDA receptors open and calcium flows in, it triggers this whole cascade of molecular events inside the neuron.
So it's not just about electrical signals changing. There's a whole other level of activity happening inside the cell.
Exactly. It's like a chain reaction. Calcium acts as a messenger, setting off a series of biochemical processes that ultimately lead to changes in gene expression and protein synthesis.
Wow, so activating these receptors can actually change what genes are turned on and off inside the neuron. That's incredible.
It is. And these changes in gene expression and protein synthesis are what drive the long-term structural and functional modifications at the synapse. They can lead, for example, to the formation of new synapses, or even changes in the number and sensitivity of glutamate receptors themselves.
So it's like a self-perpetuating cycle. The more those NMDA receptors are activated, the more they can change the structure and function of the synapse, making it even more responsive in the future. That's how learning and memory work at the most basic level.
That's a great way to put it. It's this incredible plasticity that allows our brains to adapt to new experiences, learn from them, and store those memories for later retrieval.
Now, I know you mentioned earlier that there are also some potential downsides to these receptors. Something about too much glutamate being a bad thing.
You're right, glutamate is essential for normal brain function, but just like with anything else, too much of a good thing can be harmful. Excessive glutamate signaling can lead to a process called excitotoxicity, where neurons are essentially overstimulated and can be damaged or even killed.
That sounds scary.
Yeah.
What kinds of situations can lead to this excitotoxicity?
Well, it's thought to be a contributing factor in a number of neurological conditions. For example, during a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, there's a massive release of glutamate, which can overwhelm neurons and lead to widespread cell death.
So in these cases, it's like a sudden surge of activity that throws the whole system off balance.
Exactly. And excitotoxicity is also implicated in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, where there's a gradual but persistent overactivation of glutamate receptors. This chronic overstimulation can contribute to the progressive loss of brain cells that characterizes these conditions.
That makes sense. So maintaining a proper balance of glutamate signaling is crucial for brain health. Too much can be just as detrimental as too little.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding how these receptors work and how their activity is regulated is so important. It's key to developing effective treatments for these debilitating neurological disorders.
Speaking of treatments, I'm curious about the therapeutic potential of targeting these receptors. Are there any promising avenues for drug development or other interventions?
There are a number of exciting developments in this area. Researchers are exploring a variety of approaches, including drugs that can modulate the activity of specific glutamate receptor subtypes.
So instead of just trying to increase or decrease glutamate overall, the goal is to fine-tune the activity of different receptors to restore balance.
Precisely. For example, in schizophrenia, there's evidence that NMDA receptor function is impaired. So scientists are developing drugs that can enhance NMDA receptor activity, hoping to improve cognitive symptoms in these patients.
That's fascinating. Are there any other promising therapeutic targets besides NMDA receptors?
Definitely. Researchers are also looking at ways to target AMPA receptors to enhance synaptic plasticity and improve learning and memory in conditions like Alzheimer's disease.
It sounds like the future of glutamate receptor research is full of possibilities.
It is. We're still just beginning to unravel the complexities of these receptors and their roles in both health and disease. But as we gain a deeper understanding, we open up new avenues for developing treatments that could potentially transform the lives of millions of people.
That's incredibly hopeful. It's amazing to think that these tiny receptors could hold the key to addressing some of the most challenging neurological conditions we face.
It is a testament to the power of basic science and the importance of continuing to explore the intricate workings of the brain.
Well, before we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final question for you. What's the one key takeaway you want our listener to walk away with today?
I think the most important message is that these ionotropic glutamate receptors are not just some obscure scientific concept. They're fundamental to who we are. They shape our thoughts, our memories, our emotions, and our very perception of the world.
They're the gatekeepers of communication in our brains, and their proper function is essential for everything we do.
Exactly. And understanding these receptors is not just about understanding the brain, it's about understanding ourselves.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Well, this has been an incredibly illuminating journey into the world of ionotropic glutamate receptors. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the world of neuroscience is full of wonders waiting to be discovered.
And for our listener, keep those glutamate receptors firing and never stop exploring the wonders of the brain.
Yeah, it really is amazing how these tiny receptors play such a huge role in our lives.
It is. And it's not just, the big things like learning and memory. They also influence our mood, our emotions, even our perception of reality.
So they're involved in pretty much every aspect of our conscious experience.
Absolutely. They're like the conductors of the brain's orchestra, coordinating this complex symphony of neural activity that makes us who we are.
And just like a symphony can be disrupted by a single off-key note, any imbalance in glutamate receptor activity can have some pretty profound consequences.
That's right. We talked about how excessive glutamate signaling can lead to excitotoxicity, which we know is implicated in stroke, traumatic brain injury, and neurodegenerative diseases. And on the flip side, impaired glutamate receptor function is thought to contribute to conditions like schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety disorders.
It really highlights this delicate balance that's necessary for optimal brain health. These receptors are incredibly powerful, and their activity needs to be carefully regulated.
So it's not just about having enough glutamate. It's about having the right amount in the right places at the right times.
Exactly. It's about maintaining harmony in the brain's symphony.
Well, I think this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the incredible complexity and importance of ionotropic glutamate receptors.
Me too. And the most exciting part is that we're still just scratching the surface. There's so much more to discover about these receptors and their role in shaping who we are.
I'm curious, what are some of the big unanswered...
Well, the biggest mystery is the precise role of those kainate receptors. We know they're involved in specific neural circuits, but their full range of functions is still being unraveled.
What about the interactions between the different receptor subtypes? How do they work together to orchestrate brain activity?
That's another area of active research. We're starting to understand how AMPA and NMDA receptors cooperate to regulate synaptic plasticity. But there's still a lot to learn about how the different subtypes influence each other.
It sounds like there's no shortage of fascinating questions to explore.
There isn't. And as we continue to delve deeper into the world of glutamate receptors, we'll undoubtedly gain new insights into the brain and potentially unlock new avenues for treating neurological and psychiatric disorders.
That's a hopeful thought.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways you want our listener to remember?
First, I hope they appreciate the sheer power and importance of these tiny receptors. They're not just abstract scientific concepts, they're the building blocks of our thoughts, emotions, and experiences.
And second, I hope they're inspired by the incredible complexity and beauty of the brain. It's a vast, uncharted territory full of wonders waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. So to our listener, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never stop being amazed by the incredible power of your own brain.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of ionotropic glutamate receptors.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the journey of discovery never truly ends.
Until next time, keep those synapses firing and keep exploring the fascinating world of neuroscience.